Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca,
And I'm Landon.
and we have one of our, I would say, favorite people on the planet. Wouldn't you say, Landon? As
Oh, he's
in terms
great.
of people that we've interacted with, we have the amazing Geoff Pingree with us today. How are you today, Geoff?
I'm doing fine. I'm trying to process the planet comment there. That's a big one to say.
It is, but we mean it. We mean it. You know what I mean? We mean it. We absolutely do.
and
So,
and he's coming from the other side of the planet. He's in
I
Spain. So
exactly.
yes.
That's right. He's in Spain and we're in Utah. So we have interacted with and interviewed Geoff before. I've interviewed him on other platforms. And I realized that whenever we do this, we read a brief bio and then we kind of move on and talk. But today I want to give you guys the full impact of who our friend Geoff is, because he's an incredibly interesting person, a very nice, wonderful person. So we're going to have Landon read his bio and then we will dive into our conversation.
Okay. So Geoff Pingree is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. That's the big one, the Emmy Award.
Yeah.
That's huge. A photographer, a writer, and professor of cinema studies at Oberlin College. He earned both a master's and doctorate in English and American literature and film studies at the University of Chicago and worked in public television in Washington, D.C., where he also directed Catholic University's program in media studies and George Washington University's Institute for Documentary Filmmaking. His film work has been broadcast on venues including PBS and Discovery. His photography received National Geographic's 2008 World in Focus Grand Prize. That's huge, a National Geographic photographic grand prize.
Exactly.
That shows some talent and has been published widely in magazines and newspapers, including National Geographic Traveler, the New York Times, and the International Herald Tribune. He co-edited New Media 1740 to 1914, published by MIT, a collection of scholarly essays, has authored scholarly articles on documentary and Spanish cinema, has written about media, culture, and politics for the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, Wired, The Nation, The Economist, The American Prospect, Ms. Magazine, Cinasti, and National Geographic Traveler, among others, and has worked as a correspondent in Spain for both Time and Christian Science Monitor. Again, big ones. With colleague Rian Brown, he founded and directs the Apollo Outreach Initiative, a media education and community outreach program housed in Oberlin's historic Apollo Theater. He also directs Storylens, a nonprofit organization that produces short, independent documentary films about pressing social issues in order to promote education, encourage public dialogue, and facilitate political change. With Brown, he created Blue Desert Towards Antarctica, a multi-channel video installation shot during a 3-week expedition to Antarctica. Is there anywhere you have not been? With grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ford's Foundation Just Films Initiative, he and Brown completed the Emmy Award-winning documentary, The Foreigner's Home, a feature-length documentary on the intellectual and artistic vision of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. Then I've got here some additional information. He is currently at work on a limited series documentary series on the history of race in his Northeast Ohio county. So,
And there it is. It took a little bit of time, but I wanted everybody to understand. And of course, how Landon and I connected with Geoff is because we came across his incredible film, a documentary film, The Return of Elder Pingree, Memoir of a Departed Mormon. And most of you probably are familiar with that because we talked about it so much about 6 months ago. We had a premiere here in Salt Lake. The documentary film details experiences from his mission as he goes back to kind of deconstruct and reconstruct that experience. So we're going to link that in the show notes in case you have not come across it, because that's an absolutely incredible film. So all that being said, welcome, Geoff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that long setup, and I thank you for having me. I should just say one thing, because I know how social media works, though I'm not on it much. The Toni Morrison film, The Foreigner's Home, is its title. Did not win an Emmy. It's different things. So I just don't want to connect that and have somebody come and say you're lying. Anyway.
Oh yes, that's excellent. But anyway, bottom line is Geoff is an amazing person, and we're really, really excited that we get to sit down and talk, and that he's able to take time. Like Landon said, he is in Madrid for the summer. So, and it looks wonderful. I'm looking out your window there. It just looks like a beautiful afternoon. So a little bit of a time difference. So we wanted to
afternoon here lasts till about 10 p.m. So
yeah.
Oh, what a life. What a life in the summer. That sounds amazing. It's still kind of raining and snowing here in Utah, isn't it, Landon?
Yeah, it's been
We're still waiting for the
We're
sun.
in June and it's still raining. So
I was wearing a winter coat last night when I went to the store. I was like, what is happening? It's insane. So we all need to go to Spain. Oh my gosh. So we kind of wanted to start out. Geoff was raised in the LDS church, and it kind of took off from there. So we just kind of wanted to start out by you describing a little bit about your background, how you were raised, where you were raised, and we'll just kind of let the conversation go from there.
That's a big question to respond to.
It is a big question. That's right. Tell us everything. How many interviewers do that, right? Let's just start there.
All right.
Not one detail.
Quite honestly, if you want to get a good history of my family, probably much better than my film would be to read my dad's obituary. And I'm saying this because he died 2 years ago. And I'm saying this because I come from a family of 6 children, and my parents, we were an 8 that was very close, all together for 50 years. And I think the obituary that I wrote with my brother Greg and my sister Allison kind of we had to kind of write the story of our family. And it's the longest obituary I've ever heard of, seen, come across. It is unbelievably long, and we just paid the money, I guess, because we figured this is the story. My dad, whose name was Toby Pingree, by the way, and he'll certainly come up in this conversation. So I guess I would say that because my parents both come from Mormon families, the kind where their relatives, at least along some lines, across the plains, came from Europe as members of the church to seek to be part of the Mormon community here, moving west. And so I guess you'd say pioneer families in that regard. My dad's great-grandfather was George Buchanan, and my mom's grandfather was Oscar Kirkham, who was a general authority and also an important figure in the Boy Scouts in the church, since we're going to get to controversial topics. And so I say this because there was a real path established. And I heard things a lot growing up about the importance of honoring your family from relatives, about, those relatives who've passed on are waiting for you and they expect the best from you. And so I often had this sense as I grew up of all these old relatives sitting there watching me. And of course, when I came of age sexually and otherwise, that became a far more disturbing thought for me to think that they were all watching me. But my mom and dad were, in their families, they were the only children respectively who left Utah. And not like they ran away, they rebelled, but because when they got married, we started moving. My dad and mom went and got an MBA. He was really young. He grew up in Salt Lake, as my mom did, and he went to West High School and graduated at 16, and then went to the U, did military Air Force, and then went to a mission in Guatemala, same as mine, and then went to business school at Harvard, all when he was really young. And they started having kids there. And so I was conceived in Cambridge, if we want to get to the beginning of it. And then they moved back to Salt Lake, where I was born. And then we moved around the country a lot, ending up in California when I was 13. And from then on, they stayed there until they moved back to Utah when my dad retired. So for me, growing up was mostly California, though I have important chapters in earlier places. And yet they moved not that long after I left home. And so when I go home now, it's always to Salt Lake, my ancestral family, parents, and college place, but never a place that I grew up living, ever, though people tend to assume it. So my familiarity with Mormon culture, especially in Utah, was largely through the visits at holidays and summers when we came back to Salt Lake so my parents could visit our families, their families. But also, one of the reasons they moved back when my dad retired was because I think they each felt that they had not carried their load as their siblings had all those years when their parents were old and their fathers passed away. So when my parents moved back, both of their mothers were alive, and they were there for the last chapters of both my grandmother's lives. But for me, being in Utah, I draw 2 lines here. There's my immediate family, Toby, Phyllis, my parents, and then my siblings. Tim, now a mission president in Florida. He's an otolaryngologist, excuse me, a surgeon, ear, nose, and throat surgeon who's on a mission right now. And the one member of the 6 children who's really devout in the church. I'm second, and I'm an identical twin to my brother Greg, who's a law professor in Florida. Then Allison comes right after that. There were 4 kids born in 3 years. It was, at the top. You can see that's not an unusual Mormon beginning. She teaches at the Kennedy School at Harvard and lives in Cambridge. And then my brother Matt is a doctor, a pain specialist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. My youngest brother Mark, who came kind of as the caboose, is an accountant in Northern California. He lives in Berkeley. My parents, my immediate family, the nuclear family, there's a lot to say there about the church, growing up in the church, our relationships through the church, but we are very close. We've always remained in contact and communicating. And I think, I without doubt say we all have a high level of respect for, trust in, and treat each other very well. That does not necessarily pertain once you go outside of that circle. So my relatives in Utah, broadly construed as I think about it, is a much bigger group of people, and it's much more tapped into that sense of family history. I'm not saying my parents don't honor and love their histories. I just know that my parents, I said this morning to somebody, to Karina actually, when we were very small in family home meeting, I remember becoming obsessed with this idea about going to jail, what it meant to go to prison. I don't know, maybe I was 5. We lived in Boulder, Colorado. And so I remember family home meetings saying, what happens when you go to jail? And we talked about it and asked the question, well, what would you do if I went to jail? And I just remember this very clearly. My dad and my mom, they said very clearly to us when we were small, no matter what you do, you'll be welcome in our home, even if you go to jail. And I think that's, given what we know about how your basic life narratives are shaped in early childhood, I think that was really important, because even though it was very difficult and complicated when I and other members of my family kind of departed from the church, and my dad died a devout, practicing, if liberal, Mormon. My mom's still a practicing Mormon, but that ceased to be a real point of conflict, I think mainly because I never really wondered if I was going to be sort of turned away from. That's not something that I ever had to wrestle with. And I know that's a devastatingly hard thing to deal with. So
that's very lucky, because I think a lot of the rest of us raised in the church, even though it was never said, of course, there was this sense that it was conditional. There were things, especially turning away from the teachings in the church, that would cause great disappointment. If not, we personally know people that were kicked out, cast out, when they changed. So what a wonderful, your parents sound just amazing. That's wonderful. Just to say, it doesn't matter. Your son, there's nothing you can do. I love that. That explains a lot to me about you.
I think you said your father actually even helped fund your Return of Elder Pingree movie. Is
absolutely
that?
No, yeah. He was the biggest fan of it. He wanted his friends to see it. He was the driver when we were shooting in Salt Lake, and he did contribute. I think that it was his way of bonding with me in a fashion, because we could be working on something together that was about our missions to Guatemala and the church. And even though I was sort of in a very different position vis-a-vis the church than he was, he felt like, I think that his whole life never threatened or defensive about people who challenged church beliefs. He thought that was an invitation for conversation. When we lived in Boulder and I was a little kid, same period we're talking about, he was really, really unsettled by the church's policy on Black men and the priesthood, and he challenged it. And he was on the High Council at the time, and one of the members of the High Council moved to have him excommunicated. And my dad was, he was also he was the what's the director of the Sunstone Foundation for a long time. He was one of the first subscribers to Dialogue. He was a close friend of Eugene England, which is how I initially came to know Eugene England. My dad was a real liberal Mormon who, on the one hand, his experience in life, like my mom's, it's in their bones to be Mormons, because they grew up in the Salt Lake, in the Utah Valley, in the church. All their relatives and family members and neighbors were church leaders. I don't think they could really see another way. And that's not true of me, but my dad, that was one part of him. But the intellectual part, he loved anybody with questions about anything. And although he was a bishop multiple times and a mission president, By the end of his life in the ward in Salt Lake, when they moved back, both my parents have commented on how uninteresting and sad it is for them that there's so little diversity of opinion there. And I know that my dad, they shut him down. They wouldn't let him teach Sunday school at the end of his life. And I know the last testimony he gave was when the church made its last change about children of queer people. And he had been waiting, and he stood up and just launched and said, the church has finally corrected it wrong. It's really about time. And I'm sure most of the people in this ward just thought this is a crazy old dude they want to shut down. But it was sad to me because he loved the community of being in the church, and that was really important to him. And yet, by the end of his life, the community there in Salt Lake, where he was from, kind of turned. He was probably, as I'd say, his being pushed out of his ward as someone who could speak and have a voice was probably the most traumatic exclusion in my immediate family of the church. And it was of him, who's still a practicing Mormon. I know that broke his heart.
Very ironic.
Yeah.
Oh, so how many, did you mention that some of your siblings are still attending and faithful, or have most of them?
Well, and I'm speaking now, so, everyone should speak for themselves, but this is my understanding. That goes to
I guess that's true. Good point.
Just because I think if you ask different people, you might get a different take. But Tim is a true believer. And in that sense, there's something different about us. I don't fully understand where he's coming from that, but I'm sure he doesn't fully understand where I'm coming from on that. And he's just, but I'm second. Greg and I are both kind of had a similar departure from the church. My sister Allison, I don't believe, based on my conversations with her, that she believes a lot of it or is happy about a lot of it. But I think she needs to say that for herself. I think it's harder for people to guess that because she's the one female in our family, and she's the least confrontational and provocative. And so I think a lot of people believe about her what they want to. My dad believed that until his death. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that came out, if you ever go and watch, it's online, I think still, the funeral service for my dad was on Zoom and from Salt Lake, and we all spoke. And it was, in some ways, later I realized it was all of us in some ways reckoning with him and the church. And I know my brother Matt, for example, regretted that he had never had a blunt conversation with my dad and told him that he wasn't in the church anymore. He was hiding it at the time. I don't think my dad believed that about Allison. And again, this is Allison's, we all have our own right to tell our story the way we want to. And I'm not trying to say Allison believes this and lies and says this. I'm just saying, I sense a lot about what Allison thinks that may line up with things that I would say that she maybe has not said. I don't know, but I could be educated on that and changed. But Allison should speak for herself. And then there's Matt, who's been a practicing Mormon, but only in recent years has come out effectively to his wife and children, and that's a point of deep struggle right now. And then Mark, the youngest, is the least Mormon raised. He went with my parents when they went on a mission at age 11, but when he came back, not too long after, when he was in college, he said nope, and he had his name taken off the records of the church. I believe he's the only one in our family to have done that.
Interesting.
Which is, we can have our own conversation about what that means to have your name taken off and why people do or don't do it. But he has done that, so he has nothing to do with the church. And whereas he's at the young end of the family, whereas the older kids, we were far more socialized and raised in part of big church communities. Mark was not.
That's funny you say that when you say that he was in the mission field when he was 11 years old. He was part of living in the mission home. He's the least socialized.
That's different. That's different than being socialized in a ward family. Yeah. It's different. I think
it's very different, especially when you're taken there not by your own choice. At 11, you're saying goodbye to your friends. I thought my mom very recently admitted, she says this on multiple occasions, one of the few regrets in her life is accepting that mission call.
Really?
Because I think she feels that she, again, Mom, you'll have to speak for yourself. She feels that she kind of lost in some fundamental way a relationship with Matt and Mark, the two younger ones, because Matt, who was in high school, came back and didn't stay in Ecuador, came back and spent the 3 years in high school at one of my uncle's houses. And that was a very complicated experience. My dad's brother's family. And my mom has always felt tremendous guilt about that. And Mark was down there, but she said recently, she said, I thought we were going to go with Mark and that he was going to be happy to suddenly have us all to himself. And that was not at all what he thought. And of course, now hearing that, it's laughably naive to think that some emergent teenager, all he wants is to spend time with his parents, right?
But I want to be with mom and dad nonstop.
And 300 missionaries.
Right. And I think I think in fairness, Mark would say there was a lot that happened down there that was great for him. He became friends with the missionaries. They all loved him in the office. He made a lot of friends. He learned Spanish. He had friends at this international school. It wasn't just like, a horrible thing, but overall, it was very difficult. When my parents went down there, I was not long home from my mission, and I went down with them for a chunk of the first year with the purpose of helping my mom and Mark learn Spanish. And so I went down there with them and had a great time, played a lot of basketball, did other things, and helped them with that. And this was at the time when I was kind of moving out of the church, but I was still attending. It was the first time that I ever confronted my dad and said, I'm not going to church today. And he said, it kind of, pushed him back. So it began there, but I was down there to help them. And so since I had just been in the mission field and, lived in the office and done all of that, I was, very fluent in both Spanish, but also in Mormon life and mission president house office life. And so I did. And I bring it up because I remember when I left at the end of that initial period of time, writing a note to Mark late at night. He was 11, asleep in bed in the room I shared with him. And I remember it was one of the hardest notes I've ever written because I knew I was leaving. And he was going to be alone, this 11-year-old kid, and didn't have support in the family. He had my parents, but I saw what their life was like. They were off doing the mission duties all the time. And he was this American kid down there with suddenly for 3 years with a huge question mark in front of him. And I know that would scare the crap out of him. So anyway.
So Geoff, you left the church soon after your mission, but it wasn't historical or doctrinal, or was it? What was it that led you out?
Well, I'd love to give you a great story of courage and integrity, and I prayed and realized this wasn't true and had to follow the truth and suffer for it. Here's what I'd say is the most accurate, honest version. It is, I grew up in a family that was Mormon, but also deeply loving and accepting, that was committed to being Mormons and living that culture and honoring all of the tradition, and at the same time was never going to abuse me for whatever I believed. So in some ways, it's kind of like a kid who has a parent that's angry and screaming at him all the time. That's a hard childhood, but it's not hard to draw a boundary with that parent when you get a little older. Kids who have very close relationships with their parents, as we all did, it's harder sometimes to tease out the problems and to tease out the ways you've been shaped and to stand apart. And it was very difficult, in our family to confront each other and to express anger and just sort of, fire it off. And especially when we were younger, my mom and dad both came from families. And I say this, believe me, I say sincerely, they're the best parents I've ever met. A lot of my friends say that. Of course, a lot of people think that. I'm just saying my parents are awesome parents. But I would say, again, being very blunt, I think they were much better parents probably than they were companions to each other early in their marriage. My mom, by their own admission, said we hadn't the slightest idea what the hell was going on when we got married. We were young and idiots, just doing what we thought was right, and we didn't know each other at all. And they worked on being compatible their whole lives. They had both a great marriage and in some ways a tough marriage. Again, my mom and dad, if they were listening to this, and my dad, if you're out there somewhere, I don't know what they'd be thinking me saying that, but I certainly never held back from telling them what I thought about their marriage, not because I could judge it, but just to say, hey, I think you could get along a lot better if you did this, this, and this. And this is not to say that they fought all the time. I'm just saying there was a thing between them that was unique, and they were very close, but they could have, my mom could boss my dad around, my dad could frustrate the hell out of my mom. And I guess I just think as parents, though, it was easy for them to be really loving. And you said, Landon, in the beginning, or you said, Rebecca, now I know something about you or understand the way you are, Geoff. I would say this, the way that my parents unconditionally loved us, which was their great contribution, absolutely is a huge formative foundational piece. And I've never met people who are loved that way, who don't have something that's like that. And I've never met people who are sort of cruelly denied it, who don't suffer some pretty profound damage because of it. And it's to just know kind of from the get-go that someone accepts and loves you. But I think my parents, to get back to the narrative, my parents, neither of them came from families who were very good at talking about difficult things, beliefs.
That's a Mormon thing, I think.
Yeah, no, ironically, it really is.
It's very much a Mormon thing. And so when I was young, again, we moved from Boston to New York, to Salt Lake, to Boulder, Colorado, to Ithaca, New York, to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then to California. And through those places, we were tight with each other, but we were always moving. And I remember when I was a kid, I go back and look at the few journals I kept, and all I ever wrote about was how sad I was. And at the time, I didn't realize it. But when I was in graduate school and for the first time went and started seeing a therapist to talk about, difficult things in my life, which we can get to later, but it's, I remember one of the first things that my therapist said was, well, I think when you were a kid, you might have been really struggling with some depression and some anxiety. And of course, at the time, I had no idea what to call that. But when you're a little kid, anything that makes you feel terrible that isn't where you don't have someone helping you to explain what that is and why it isn't who you are, you internalize it and you put it on yourself. I was, again, an identical twin, which meant that I saw the world through the lens of, I share everything with this person. Isn't that great? Yeah. Isn't it terrible? Yeah. Everything's shared. Your identity is in question. People are looking at you all the time, trying to figure out who you are. Are you this one or that one, and not remembering. And it's a built-in sense of rivalry that my brother Greg and I have struggled with our whole lives. It's central to our conversation with each other about who we are. So I say this because I was pretty under a lot of pressure to perform. We were achievers. My dad lived by the philosophy, there's always more. You have to always do your best, never complain. We get that, right? And that has its good outcomes. I did a lot of accomplished things in my life, but boy, a lot of those accomplishments that you read on paper, underneath it was this very depressed, anxious, discouraged person who wasn't sure that he believed in anything, and certainly didn't know how to find joy in any of those accomplishments. And so I was an anxious and depressed kid, I think. I think there's some depression in my family, especially on my mom's side. My grandmother, her mother, whom I loved and was very close to, but she was an incredibly difficult person, I think, by any measure. Super intelligent, super accomplished, the child of a general authority who was never home. That says a lot about where her anger came from, I'm pretty sure. And she was just sort of like as difficult to deal with as my mom is easy to deal with. And I think you can kind of see the family, the intergenerational negative to positive thing happening there. And but it was very difficult for my mom to, she wants to make things good. She wants people to feel comfortable. She doesn't want conflict and confrontation. My dad's was a lot more comfortable with it, but he too didn't come from a family where you just talked about all that. So in that sense, they were both really trailblazers in their families, in having a family, and my dad used to joke, when do I get to stop paying for my kids going to college? We all went to school forever. We never stopped. And I don't say that as just a plus. There's a plus to it, but there's a lot of not plus to it. And
right.
I think, we all were sort of felt encouraged to explore what we wanted, to pursue the life of the mind, and to not ever feel real danger or threat about taking the wrong step about what we believed. That's the grand picture, and it's there. Within that, it's very complicated for anybody to say, I don't believe what you believe. I don't believe what this family's narrative is built on. I don't believe the thing that we've all shared all these years. Now, the things that we've talked about, I don't believe the story that says we will be together when we die, which is something I talked about with my dad a lot at the end of his life.
Which must have been difficult as close as you are to your father.
Very difficult. Very difficult.
Obviously, you'd want to have that, but you still say, no matter how much I want it, I can't believe it.
Can't believe it, yeah.
Of the 6 children, I was the one who got divorced. My sister got divorced but remarried, and so for many years I've been kind of single, and I'm also the one child who has no children. And so what does that mean? It's when my dad started to develop a lot of physical problems when he hit 80, basically. So for the last 7 or 8 years of his life, anytime they needed more help, I was often the one who was there. So I ended up spending a disproportionate amount of time in Salt Lake with my parents, right? And then I was there right through his death. Was the one there when he died, and kind of had to arrange his funeral and do it on Zoom, which was, and so that time I spent with them, those last few years of his life, were really meaningful and important to me. I would never trade them. They're also really difficult because he was not himself at all. one of the things that happened with my dad when he developed what, is common in older people, he lost his executive function. He developed an aggressive form of Alzheimer's at the very end, but his tolerance and his ability to be curious and comfortable with other people's different opinions kind of diminished. And he became a little crankier and a little more reactionary, which surprised me. But again, at his funeral, I commented and said, and I still believe that I don't think that was really a reflection of his deepest beliefs. I think he was going through what people go through at that age, which is you return to your earliest anxieties and hang on because you're losing control of everything. And his went to like money and simpler beliefs. But we had conversations at the end, and I remember saying to him, "What is it that bothers you so much?" And he said, "I guess that I think you're kind of renouncing the family to leave the church because you won't be with us after this life." And he'd never said that before.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
And I said, "Well, it's really hard, Dad, that for people who love each other and are close to believe different stories about the whole eternal enterprise, right? Whether it ends with me in the dirt and chemicals and atoms and all that, which I think is true no matter what you believe, or it ends there physically, and then I'm, launched into whether you take the Mormon view that I totally dismiss, which is of, uninteresting, boring white men walking around in suits in a lighted room or something. I don't know what it is. I've never what could you do there?
I think you hit it on the head. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So.
Or even something more complex, which I have to allow for. I'm not trying to just that was a joke. And no matter how you slice it, I said, Dad, you believe that in a month or in a year or in 6 months, when you're gone, it's just going to be a while and then we'll hang out together.
Yeah.
I'm saying goodbye to you forever. Yes. And so I'm not trying to say I got it worse than you, but I kind of do have it worse than you, given what I believe. And it's not that I chose to believe what I do because I wanted to continue my teenage rebellion well into my adult life. Sure, I was a teenager and we all rebel, but anybody who thinks that leaving the church is a teen rebellion issue beyond a pretty circumscribed time period, that's just a lame excuse. Because believe me, my life would be a lot easier if I just decided to stay in the church. There were what didn't come with everything getting easy. There was liberation for me, but it didn't make it easy with family. Certainly not with extended family and with other friends that I lost. So that difference of belief came into kind of a focus at the end of his life. And one of the things that I'm most happy about or glad for, or grateful for, really, is that I had all that time at the end, and I was able to kind of confront it. Like there was nothing unsettled between me and my dad when he died. And that is not true of everyone in my family. I see struggle. So,
well, that's a rare opportunity to be able to do that. I mean, that's unusual. Most people have regrets after there's a passing like that. And they're like, I wish I would have said, or I could have said, or that's amazing that you had that opportunity. That's incredible. Interesting.
So you left the church soon after your mission, but then you went on to BYU. How did that transpire?
That era of your life is so fascinating.
BYU is not where you want to go.
Well, the way it went is, again, large family, Dad, who after every report card sat each one of us down and had a conference and said, the only question that matters is, did you do your best? But at the same time, would take us out to dinner and give, my sister remembers the dinner we went out to where, because she'd gotten the best grade, she got to order steak and we only got something lesser on the menu. I think, what was he thinking? But my dad, that is the family he came from. Everything was about you utilize yourself. We used to joke about in his later years that, if he was in a bad mood one day, we'd say he's not fully utilized today. He hasn't fully utilized his time because I saw this picture in my mind of him that I took of him. I used to go spinning with him at the Steiner Center in Salt Lake at 5 a.m, and he spun well into his 80s. And I still remember one of the last times he did it, we were spinning outside on this deck out there, and the class had gone home and he was still doing it. I took a picture of him alone on his bike, this old, hunched over figure, and he couldn't stop. He had to do something with his time. He had to. He had no other way of understanding the world. And that has been a real problem for me in my life because I feel the weight and the pressure that I need to do that, or I feel guilty or ashamed, but I don't want to do that. And that's not the way to live. And here's a good anecdote. My dad got up and worked out every day of his stinking life. And we all inherited that. And I've been a maniacal workout, athletic, sports person my whole life. And I've loved a lot of that. But this thing that says if you don't exercise, you feel crappy, you feel terrible about yourself.
Yes.
You know, my dad's gone and he died in a massive decline of health. He lost all the things that mattered to him. He couldn't walk, he couldn't think, and he couldn't read anymore. That killed him, and he became a different person. My mom has never exercised on a program a day of her life. She loves being active. She does stuff. She's 87 and crawling around on the floor, pulling pots and pans out of the cupboard still, making food, doing everything. I'm like, who do I want to be like, my mom or my dad? My dad beat himself into submission. And I think that is literally something that happens. You know, I think that workout mentality, there's never enough, you have to do more and more and more, no pain, no gain, is a very apt physical kind of metaphor of how Mormonism works on us emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. You just have to beat yourself into submission to shape yourself into what you're supposed to be. And then you stand there looking at this beautiful shape you've pounded out, this resume of all these accomplishments that you read at the start of this thing. And inside you feel like shit. You don't feel good about yourself. You don't enjoy anything that you have. And you say, how did I get to this point where people can walk around saying, wow, you're so accomplished, dude. You're so awesome. And you feel like, I don't even know how to be happy. I don't even know how to choose what I want. I don't even know what I want or how to know what I want. It's really kind of a bummer, right? It's a very
I think you're never at rest in that way. When you described your father, it's a lot like my father. And I think they're similar, maybe ages. My dad is, almost late 80s. He would do the same thing. He had an exercise bike in our home, but that wasn't enough just to be riding the bike. He had to put a lectern kind of attached to it so that he could read conference talks and study. That wasn't enough. He had to attach a battery to the back of the bike. So while he was riding, it would juice up this battery, for the last days or whatever. We would have power on hand. I mean, you're absolutely right. That mentality of that age.
I'm surprised he didn't have like somebody translating, doing a language lesson at the same time, so he could.
Well, no, it probably, there was a microfilm reader on the side, and he was doing genealogy. No, it was all like that, and very similar to your dad. My dad is still living. In fact, they're celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary on Saturday. But the very same thing. Incredible decline in health, exactly what you described. My dad has lost that too. And it's a very similar situation. And, these driven people in the Mormon construct, there's just no end. There's no way to ever feel rest, right? There's no way, I think. So, wow, that's so fascinating.
I definitely noticed the similarity because your dad also went to college at 16.
Yep, at 16, very young, got his PhD by the time he was barely early 20. Yeah, he was a nuclear scientist. So similar kind of person. So interesting.
It's fascinating because I think we're all realizing, at least I am, that, multitasking has a very toxic dimension to it. And certainly spiritual multitasking is going to come with a price, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
That is the phrase. My goodness. But then you ended up at BYU.
Well, so we're doing this. So we're in California. We went to high school in Northern California. I loved living there. It's a great place. Lived in the east, in the Bay, Walnut Creek, Bay Area. I grew up with this big ward of friends, but we were out of Utah. It was just a fun place. A lot of sports, a lot of, activities, the stuff the church doesn't do anymore, like road shows and basketball tournaments and, dance festival and all that stuff. And when I went to college, I did well in high school. We all did quite well because, again, we were all pretty driven for that. But I didn't really I think I only applied to schools outside of BYU because my dad was kind of like, aren't you going to apply to some Ivy League schools? Or it's weird because I go back to that time in my life and I can't quite understand what I was thinking. And I think I wasn't thinking very much about college or what it meant. And so I only applied to BYU and then 3, I think Harvard, Yale and Princeton, just almost out of a hat, and went through and did all the interviews and ended up going to BYU. Both Greg and I did because, well, Tim had gone there already and had a scholarship. Greg got the Kimball Scholarship, which is the big one then, named after the president of the church. And I got the next one after that. That we can talk about that, what that did to me as a twin, but basically we all, and I think Allison got to Kimball as well. Anyway, so it was all scholarship, and I think I probably looked at it and saw I don't have to pay anything, I won't have any debt, and my Tim had gone there and was really happy, and so I look back on it now and I think, okay, here's what I really believe about BYU. And this is crucial. When I went to BYU, late 70s, early 90s. it was a different place. Yes, it was BYU. Yes, it was the Mormon school. Yes, it was the Lourdes University. No, it was nothing like it is today. No. And I know that from going down there and looking at it and the experience. It's not. It's just not. We had the honors program there. I was heavily involved in it. My first teacher and mentor at BYU throughout those years, and later was Eugene England. My first class and half my classes were about learning how to learn. We questioned everything. And did it create waves? Yes. We went and unfurled a political banner at the Harris Fine Arts Center when General Westmoreland came and almost got kicked out. But we didn't. We did that. We started the Seventh East Press. We held all these. It was a different place then, I'm telling you. And
yep. No, I concur. I was started in 84 and it was absolutely a different environment. And make sure everyone understands he started the Seventh East Press. Tell everybody what that is, because to me that's such a huge deal.
I was one of the original group of editors. I don't want Gary Bergera and everyone else to say, wait a minute, no. Those two, they were driving forces who were not me. I got in as the features editor with that original group. And so, yes, I would say I claim some responsibility and help pushing it along. And I remember the history and getting it published and what we did on the April Fool's edition, which anybody who remembers it, I still have copies if anybody wants one in my closet somewhere.
I would love a copy.
Funniest satires on BYU Mormon culture you will ever see. And we went around at 5 a.m. and put them in all the places where the Daily Herald or whatever was, the Daily Universe is picked
Daily
up.
Universe, yeah. So for listeners or viewers that aren't familiar, on BYU campus, there's the Daily Universe. That's the university newspaper. Well, throughout history, there have been these little alternative, wonderful journals, periodicals, newspapers that kind of pop up. And this is one of the big ones of that era. Absolutely. So, so exciting.
It's in a different time because, I mean, then... So let me go on here. So, okay, I go to BYU, and the reason for that is there's a lot of reasons. It's kind of a complicated thing with no simple and obvious answer, because I don't look at it and think, wow, I didn't want to go to a good school, because I'm sure I did. But I think BYU felt like it belonged more in the world of actual universities to me then. And if someone who's going to BYU takes offense at that, at me saying it was once an actual university and implying it's not one now, I'm sorry, but like I judge it by its works. Like act like a university then and admit differences of opinion. Then you're a university. I'm not making that story up. That's what BYU does. So
that is it. Was there a religious component to you going? I mean, did you say it's the Lord? You know, I'm a Mormon. This is where I go, or was that, you seem like maybe you were not quite like that.
And sometimes in my family, we've talked and joked with my parents that if I had gone to Berkeley instead of BYU, they think I maybe would still be in the church. I don't think that, because I think there's something about me deeply, inherently, and that doubted things and questioned things that was there. But I do think it would have been a very different path. And the going to BYU gave me all kinds of, ways to see the things I did not like about Mormonism. I know that Greg and I remember we were the only ones. I hated immediately that when the national anthem went off in the morning at night, everyone stopped. I said, why do I have to stop? I'm not required to stop. So I didn't stop. I walked. And boy, did I create problems. I remember one day when the ROTC guy ran and tackled me. And, because I just said, I'm not stopping. But, they didn't kick me out. Nothing like that happened. And,
Did you know that Landon on campus? That's Landon went to Utah State University. But
I was in the military, and I know at every military post you have to stop and do that.
No, this was on campus. They would do that, and you'd have to just hold still, even if you were late or...
It's like, but to me, it's more like the Colin Kaepernick thing. It's not about, do I hate the flag and want to stomp on it? It's, I don't want to be forced to respond to the flag in exactly the way you're prescribing it, and that everyone has to. Whether it's because of my early years in the church or not, I've never been a joiner. I'm very uncomfortable conforming and being parts of groups in general. And I think there's the church there, there's me being a twin there, there's me being part of a large homogenous family there. People used to tease us, we were like the Brady Bunch. There's something about that I've always pushed away from. I want to be on my own. I want to be independent. I want to be solitary. I don't want to just go along. So really groupthink activities make me deeply uncomfortable. Yeah.
So BYU was perfect for you.
It was perfect. Well, so I go to BYU, and I remember, 6 kids, and the older 4 of us are within 4 years of each other. So Tim goes, then goes on his mission. Greg and Geoff go and go on their missions. Allison goes and goes on her mission. All 4 of us were at BYU at part of the same time. And I went to BYU, and again, my freshman year hadn't gone. I'm enrolling in a late summer honors, which is a component of the honors colloquium that begins in the fall. So that means going 2 weeks early, reading a bunch of books with a professor and getting early stimulation. The late summer honors that Greg and I just happened to sign up for was the prequel to the colloquium called Learning How to Learn that was taught by Eugene England. I'm sitting there with my dad in the late 70s looking at this thing. We're about to go to college. And he says, oh, your professor is Eugene England? And I'm like, yeah, Eugene England, who's that? He said, I went to college with Eugene England. We wrote for the Utah Daily sports paper together at the U together. He went on, he said, Gene was such a good writer, we had to kick him off the sports page because he wrote too much lyrical stuff. We just wanted him to tell the sports and he wouldn't do it. And he laughed, he said, we were old friends. And then he told me he started this thing called dialogue and whatever. And I was kind of like, oh, interesting. So, okay. Now I had brushes with controversy before. My dad, challenging the Black position on the priesthood earlier when he, people in his stake high council wanted him excommunicated, or him, questioning the role of women in the church, saying, they should have more of a prominent role, stuff like that. My family was pretty open to you question things. He's the one who told me, every Saturday when we were little, he'd take one of us on a trip with him. And on one of my trips, I asked him about the nature of God. And at one point, I just remember him saying, we don't know a lot, and you should always question what you get. Don't just take it because it's told to you. Doubt it. And so that was there, and I doubted a lot. But things started to happen. I remember I was in a Sunday school class when he was the bishop in Ithaca, New York, and my teacher was going on and on about tithing. And for some reason, I was just like, my nonconformist streak was profoundly offended. And at a certain point, she just said, Geoff, what do you have to say about tithing? And I said, well, I want to pay my tithing to the devil. And she went to my dad in tears, and she never taught Sunday school again. Oh. And my dad, everyone in our ward in Ithaca knew that the bishop's kids were the worst kids, right?
Critical thinkers. There you go. Very dangerous.
Exactly. So I come back from so I go on my mission. This is my freshman year. Before my mission, then colloquium was 8 credit hours. That's half your schedule. Yeah. So I went to this colloquium, which was Eugene England's first year at BYU. He's been out there in the world. He's got his PhD at Stanford. He's taught at St. Olaf's because he can't get a job at BYU because he's too controversial. Finally, he gets in. Part of it is Dallin Oaks and Jeff Holland, the presidents, 2 I had. They were close to him then. Not later. They betrayed him later, and I'm happy to talk about it on record. Yeah. I was there. I saw it all happen. And he starts teaching there. The first year we came there, his first year, he's got this new colloquium in the honors program called Learning How to Learn. And so Greg and I are 2 of the students in this 15-student colloquium. We meet every single day from like 1 till 5 p.m. every day of the whole semester. Gosh. So we spent a lot of time with him. We went on a outward bound trek with him. We went on trips with him. We took him to the NCAA March Madness. We took him to a jazz game. We played tennis with him. We played basketball with him. We hung out at their house. We were very close to him. And he shaped my worldview. Absolutely. I still think Learning How to Learn is good a way. It's not a sexy name, but it's pretty much what I still teach to my students at Oberlin College. It's like, this is what you're here to learn, how to be a human being that can continue to learn and be open, not how to master a camera or memorize chemical formulas. It's how to learn, how to evolve, to have a growth mindset. And I got that from Gene, which really started with my dad, right? You can see the steps here. Yeah. So to answer your question, Landon, in a super long-winded way, is we went on our missions. I remember Gene writing me my mission, me expressing doubts, They lived right next to the MTC. I remember visiting him at the MTC. I went on a mission to Guatemala, had profound doubts. If you watch my film, you know all about that. I'm expressing doubts throughout my journal, blah, blah, blah. But, my mission goes from being a kind of nightmarish hell from the first half to a much better one on the second half, largely because the new mission president knew my dad and was a kid in Guatemala when my dad was a missionary there. And so he calls me to be his assistant eventually. We become very close. I enjoy missionary work much more because I'm connected to the community, which I think is a real thing. That doesn't change. And that's kind of what we were going to talk about. Maybe we'll get to it, about what happens when you're part of a community and then you don't believe the same things anymore. Are you suddenly, we're not friends anymore? It's dead. So that was all happening. I come back from my mission with determination to stick to what I believe, but knowing inside there was something missing. And as I put it in my film, when I got off the plane on my return, something inside said, "This isn't going to work. It's not going to hold you well. You're not going to fit in this culture anymore." And I battled that and denied it because, the price of going with that meant a huge amount of change and a huge amount of discomfort and a huge amount of heartbreak for a lot of people that I cared about, and not to mention me. So your question was, did you leave in a sort of simple way? No, the way I left is I slowly inched and bled my way out of it. And part of it was because I just probably didn't have the guts to stand up and say, I got to go now. And I didn't know any other way to do it. And so, I finished at BYU. The 3 years after my mission, I was at BYU, but I went less and less and less to church. The last bishop we had was Joseph Fielding McConkie, who
what a name, right?
who in his interview with my brother about a sexual thing, didn't even get to that. All he wanted to do was rant at us because he knew we were connected to Eugene England. All he did was rant about how Eugene England could not wash away his sins with powdered milk for Poland. If you remember, Gene was in milk or food for Poland back then. And that's a political thing.
Yep.
All he wanted to do was slam Eugene England. So, Greg and I, Tim kept going to church. We were all in the same ward that last year. Greg and I slowly receded. I remember going to church at the very end, just showing up kind of in a nominal way and then running home and ordering Domino's and turning on the NFL, and which is pretty much what I still do.
Which you could get away with at BYU back then. Absolutely, you could not today. And you, in fact, Geoff, were the valedictorian that year, weren't you, in '84 when you graduated? Am I right on that?
That is correct. That is correct.
Okay, because I was thinking my freshman year started the fall of '84, so we just barely missed each other. But
exactly,
yeah. But I interacted with Eugene too through, English classes and meetings in his home, and just, of course, not to the level you did, but he was an icon there. And I would love for you to talk about what eventually happened, because I think many people knew him, loved him, were devastated by some of the end results, and still think about it to this day,
And I want to return those statements. I said Jeff Holland and Dallin Oaks betrayed him.
Yes.
Those are big things to say. So when we get to them, please pay attention. I don't say them lightly or casually or with intent to be disrespectful. I say it because I was with Gene at times when I saw what happened and what the pain that was caused. So
I need to clarify one thing here. You were the valedictorian. Was your brother the salutatorian? Is that the next one?
Salutatorian, yeah.
You may not have got the scholarship, but you got the valedictorian.
Well, he was the one. He was he got the Spencer Kimball Scholarship going to BYU.
Right.
Valedictorian leaving BYU, and there is a relationship there, because as a twin, competitive to everything, I thought, I was absolutely chastened when Greg got a higher scholarship and thought, I'm going to outdo him now. And I do not say that proudly, because it is a toxic influence in your life to be competing all the time. What did I say? Who said it? John Adams or somebody, that competition or comparison is the thief of happiness, of joy. Oh, it is. Boy, is it. Greg and I have worked to be non-competitive our whole adult lives, and it's just built into our DNA almost that everything's a rivalry. I don't recommend it. So anyway, he and I both spoke at graduation. There's a story there, but my GPA was a little higher than Greg's. That made me the valedictorian, but we were the two graduation speakers. The speaker at the person who got an honorary degree, and the speaker behind us was Bruce McConkie.
Ooh.
My dad
was,
it was wild. And we gave a talk. We knew since Bruce McConkie was speaking that we had to give a talk that if we expressed anything honest, we're going to have to encode it, symbolize it. What artists have always done, symbolize your dissent, so that the fascists in power can't understand it. It's what political artists do. It's whatever.
Well, love symbolize your, say that again.
Dissent.
You've got to disguise your opposition to the power by putting it in enough carefully wrought artistic media that they don't even get what you're saying. But anyone who wants to pay attention does. So the most subversive films during the Spanish Civil War and right after, during Franco's era, are all movies that are stories about families that, if you read them, look at them carefully, they're about the family of Spain and what's wrong with it. But of course, Franco and his generals didn't read them that way because they didn't understand movies. People who are political authoritarians, by definition, don't understand nuance, subtlety, complexity, which is what human being is all about and what art is all about. So Greg and I remember this very distinctly because they came to me from the BYU, and this is another thing that would never happen today. I'm sure this will horrify any practicing Mormon who hears it from the church, from BYU. They had a practice then, as most schools do, and BYU certainly did, that they needed to vet the talk. And they asked for it 4 weeks in advance. Well, anybody who knows me and Greg, and on this spot, I don't know who does, but you know that we can procrastinate with the very, very best in the world. And we wrote that talk, wrote it at 4 a.m. the day of, okay? And so I remember being badgered by the person in charge of the commencement saying, you have to give us a talk to vet, you have to. And I just said, I don't have a talk. I can't give it to you because I don't have it. Their choice was to shut us down or not. And they didn't. And we got up and gave a talk. We wrote it as a dialogue between us. And it actually was recorded on Utah television. And I have a VHS tape of it, which I can't bear to watch, but there it is. If you ever want it, I actually do have a copy of it.
Wow.
And it says Greg and Geoff getting up and giving this talk that's back and forth, and we built in all kinds of subversive comment to it. I don't think it was obvious to very many people. And Bruce McConkie got up right after us, and he got up there and said, well, I've read the Plato's dialogue, and now I've heard the Pingree's dialogue, or something like that. And Greg and I kind of looked at each other and thought, well, at least he didn't really pay attention to anything we said, right? So he's not offended. There it is.
Wow.
Gosh. That is just incredible.
So I'm there for that year. I go on a mission. I come back. The last few years, I'm sailing out of church. And at the end of our years at BYU, Eugene England is going to take a group to London, study abroad in London, the thing he loved most. He loved doing it. I see why. He was an English professor, a Shakespeare scholar. He loved the Romantic poets, and he had done it before, and he just loved it. And I understood why when I went with him. So he's taking a study abroad there the year after we graduate, Greg and I as seniors. Well, we both wanted to go to graduate school, or decided to. So we applied, but we didn't get around to it. So we did it a year later. So we had a year in between.
Because you procrastinate.
Well, that's certainly a huge part. Absolutely, we did.
They're the most successful procrastinators I've ever heard of.
That's right.
You will never get a defensive response in the least from either of us by saying that, Landon. I promise you. We both know it's true, and we have to. So but basically, he asked me and Greg to be his teaching assistants for the study abroad, since we were in that year between. And we stuck around. My parents were in Ecuador as mission presidents. We didn't have a place to go home to. So I stayed on, and we were nominally in the graduate program at BYU. And so we taught, English classes as TAs and et cetera. And then we went on the study abroad with Eugene England as his assistants. My sister, Allison, happened to go as a junior or senior in college as a student in the same program. And then there are a bunch of other people. So it was Jean and Charlotte and Jane and Rebecca at the time, and Mark. And their other kids were older and visited, but we all went over there. And that was his then last time. And what happened over there is that I publicly left the church there in London. Well, I went once and then didn't go again. Now think about this. A Mormon BYU study abroad in London, the two TAs, which today you'd basically have to have a temple recommend for and effectively be a religious leader for. Greg and I think I will say proudly and without apology, we're great intellectual leaders. We were terrible spiritual examples. We never went to church, and we got blamed for a lot of stuff because of that. And, there were other reasons to blame us for things, but that wasn't one of them. I remember Gene sitting in Gene's apartment on a Sunday afternoon, the second Sunday after we didn't go to church, talking to him about what was happening. And this was a very pivotal moment in my life and in my relationship with him. I remember talking to him and telling him very honestly what I believed and didn't believe, and that I needed to leave the church. And he said to me, referring to an old friend of his named, I believe, George Smith, he said, it might be the right thing for you to do to leave the church. And no one had ever said that to me before. Even my own dad, after my mission, when I can talk to him eventually about it, said, "It breaks my heart that you're leaving, but I respect your decision for being independent and doing your own life." But even he was difficult. But when Gene said that to me, it was really important, because I felt the kind of affirmation and support that, I felt like he understood where I was. And I from then on, it didn't suddenly make me happy and make it easy, but it gave me some kind of, I want to call it spiritual and intellectual capital, to feel like this is an honest undertaking. Because the thing I felt tempted to experience whenever I questioned beliefs, or when I left the church, or when I made my film, or anything like that, was shame. Because there were always going to be a lot of disappointed, disapproving Mormons. And shame for anyone who's grew up a Mormon and has battled with how can you be a normal sexual being and a Mormon at the same time, knows that shame is just the water you bathe in. And it's a really damaging thing to a lot of people, and it certainly was to me. I think it made my whole relationship with sex permanently complicated, way beyond what it should be, and has led to a lot of unhappiness. It's something I will battle with till the day I die. I'm certain of it. So I kind of left the church in London, and I think Greg did too. Allison, there was always a lot going inside of her head that she didn't say out loud, that Greg and I barked out. Greg more than I'll give him credit. He was more of the outspoken one than I was. And I think that's when it started. And so when we came back from London, we both then went to graduate school the next year to study whatever we did. And he went to Brown and I went to Chicago. And, we had applied to graduate schools, identifying the top 12 and picking them out of a hat, so that we couldn't go to the same grad school, because we decided it was the right thing at this point in our lives, having gone to BYU together, to have separate lives. So he's going off to Brown, I'm going to Chicago. And
you never considered graduate school at BYU. You're like, not going to be, yeah. He's like,
by then it was clear to me. Like, I knew what I liked about BYU, and I'm not shy about defending it.
Right.
I'm not just Mormonism down. No, it's too complicated to say that. There's a lot of things I loved at BYU and had a good time there, but the things that are deep and that matter, that have become worse and worse and worse since I was there, are too important to me. You can't support those things in good conscience. I can't. So off we went to grad school, and it was really in grad school where I left the church in a more formal way. I had never drunk alcohol before. I remember asking friends at graduate school parties. I'm 25 years old, a couple years older, which means nothing now, but at the time I felt like I'm this old guy. I went on a mission. They're all 22 and 25. How can it be? But I remember asking them with great embarrassment and shame, like, what's a screwdriver? What's a whiskey and whatever? What do these things mean? Right. And figuring that out is when I first smoked marijuana. It's when I was just experimenting. I first had sex when I was 25, which is really late. And I'm not here to tell people what about my sex life. But just to say that
it's all part of it. These experiences are normal adult things. They are delayed for people who are raised in Mormonism. And then when you get on the other side of it, and distorted, they are. And you feel, that's why sometimes we'll have episodes on how to drink coffee. Don't be afraid, go order it. The simple things, the adult things, you are never allowed to actualize and understand. So no, these are poignant stories. You laugh kind of, but it's a real thing. And there's a lot of confusion.
But a lot of confusion. And as I'm telling this story, I'm realizing that this sort of structure that's here. So in Chicago, I'm doing these things for the first time that most kids did when they were younger. They represent big things. I remember still the day that I went behind my apartment in Hyde Park in Chicago. It was freezing winter when I decided to stop wearing my garments. And I took them off. And even though I didn't believe, I still had enough of a kind of respect, fear. What am I doing? Is this the wrong thing? Relationship with it all. I remember cutting the marks off and burning them, as I had been told to do, because I thought, at least I don't want to incur the wrath of the temple. If it's like, I wanted to hedge my bets, right? Because, that whole thing with the temple, like going through the temple before my mission scared the absolute shit out of me. I thought, whoa, what did I just promise? How could I do that? I have no idea what I was just supposed to do. But, there I was. not believing it. Why am I wearing this underwear? But if I take it off, I'm really out there. I'm actually in that group that they condemn and say it can suffer terrible penalties. I'm a denier of the faith, right? Where am I? I'm going to hell, basically, right? This is a big thing. What if I'm wrong? Right? So that was happening when I went to the University of Chicago. And I think it's really interesting because I'm on my own there completely. So many of my sort of independent things started, but I went to Chicago in large part because Eugene England recommended that I go there and study with this guy who had been one of his great influences named Wayne Booth, who was a Mormon, grew up in Utah, went off and became this really prominent literary scholar at the University of Chicago. He was a lapsed Mormon, and yet he hung out with and made community with the Mormons till the day he died. He was from American Fork. And he told me till the day he died, he still had a part of him that felt like he should be going back to church, even though he couldn't believe it. And when they, and we'll talk about that in a minute, when Gene got booted from BYU again later in his career, I remember Wayne showing me correspondence he had with Dallin Oaks, who had been his mission companion. Dallin Oaks and Marion D. Hanks had been people he knew in his mission. Wait, let me back up. I want to put an asterisk. He may not have been a mission companion of Dallin Oaks, but they were very close. No. He was mission companion with Marion D. Hanks, and they were very close till the very end. You can kind of see that there if you think about it. Dallin Oaks, he came to know because Wayne was at the University of Chicago grad school, and Dallin Oaks was a prominent law professor at Chicago. That's when Dallin Oaks had high credentials in the legal community. And he and Wayne were very close intellectually. Well, when this happened to Gene later, Wayne started writing to Dallin Oaks, and I'll tell you about that when we get to that story. But basically, Wayne Booth told me about how he was a missionary in Chicago, and he decided he didn't believe it then, started drinking coffee then. So my dissertation advisor was a guy who himself had grown up, been fully socialized as, and left the church in a Mormon family. So Mormon that his wife's father was my grandfather's mission companion and best friend. Right?
There's no end to this, right?
All there. So I'm saying this because Wayne used to tell me that when his father-in-law would come to town, they'd run and hide the wine in the cupboard and put the coffee behind the, right? You get that, right? And so my point is, I had these three hugely influential male mentors who were all in the church to some degree or another, and also were very understanding and supportive of the complexity and embraced the path that may lead out. My dad, Eugene England, and Wayne Booth. And it was like a natural 1, 2, 3. So in a way, I think I had the luckiest of all paths because I had support, understanding, and respect all the way along. Even though inside I was struggling massively with my self-worth, with my feeling of like, I'm doing a terrible thing, with self-contempt, which I still struggle with. That stuff's, burned into you when you're very young. And, so my leaving the church was a very gradual thing, and it was kind of contextualized by all these events through BYU and then Chicago and grad school. I took 10 years to get my PhD, which in the old days was kind of a common thing because it was a joke. Not any longer today. They push your butt through in 4 years. Yeah. I got through in 10 years. And you know why I got through with any shame or problem? Because Wayne Booth was my dissertation advisor, and he got the Mormon procrastination thing. He never judged me for it. He knew immediately what was going to happen with me. He saved my ass so many times, and he's gone now. And I just I hope anybody knowing Wayne listening to this will remember. Those three people, my dad, Gene, and Wayne, I love and revere all of them for how kind, humane, and supportive they were with me, and honest. Because they all really shaped my life. And here I am out of the church, and Wayne got out, but Gene and my dad stayed in. But there was a kind of an integrity along that path that I try to emulate, but I would never, and I mean this, I would never see myself as having the level of integrity that any of those three had. And that's why they were important to me, because they really stood by what they believed, and they spoke out and took the consequences. I don't feel like I've ever paid a price at all like they had to pay. So
wow. No, you're so lucky. And it's so wonderful that you can talk about them and share stories about them and, keep all of that alive, because it's a unique experience now that you describe it in that way. That's wonderful. It's amazing.
I mean, I think, let me just add, and we may come back to some of this, but I want to say here that, and I want to be careful about how I say this. probably a conversation about Gene England and my relationship with him should be a larger, separate conversation, and Greg at least should be involved because he had a very similar relationship and was part of the thing that happened. That, in recent years, I left the church back close to college, and then these decades passed, and then I started to pay attention to the church again when I made my film and showed it. And so now, like talking to you guys, I think this is what the church is like now. Here's what young people are like. And I've attended some Sunstone things, and I've attended some things, and I've attended a couple of symposia organized around Gene. And I've noticed something, these two biographies that came out in the last couple of years, Terrell Givens and I'm forgetting her name. I'm sorry, Valerie, is it Hegstrom? Anyway, Valerie, did I get that right or wrong? Anyway, they're kind of different, but each of them in their own way, there's something very notable about them that I've also noticed in a lot of the talks by younger people who are progressive in the church and want to honor Gene. You said Gene's become an icon. He is now. Yeah. He was a very, very imperfect, flawed dude that I relied on heavily when I was in college, like my dad's age. And although I understood he was important, my dad has said he was a big deal in dialogue. He was no icon to me for a long time because I suffered through things with him. And by that, I don't mean I didn't respect him. I just mean he was not. I have, kids.
Well, you were close. You were close. You were too close to see that he was an icon to others. And then time makes someone an icon, and to have founded dialogue. Yeah, exactly. And for our viewers and listeners, I was just going to say dialogue is the dialogue of, is it Mormon? Dialogue of Mormon Thought, right? Yeah, it's a magazine
Journal of Mormon Thought, right.
Journal of Mormon Thought for decades and decades. It's one of the first things when I worked at BYU, I was cataloging it. And I'm like, what's this? And I start going through the pages and I'm going, wow, it just has it's very alternative.
No, and my dad told me about it. My dad was one of the first subscribers. He has the whole set, all that stuff. And, I heard, what's his name? I want to remember his name to be respectful to him because I Instagrammed him after his talk, but gave a talk at a recent Sunstone on a panel about Gene, and the way he spoke of him and that he had been able to have the honor of working with Terrell Givens to go through Gene England's archive. And I was like, that is an honor, but my gosh, I was there when all that stuff was actually happening. I was having those conversations, reading about it. And I kind of emailed him or communicated with him and said, hey man, if you really want to hear, I imagine I came off sounding like the old guy who wants to tell you the way it really was.
Back in my day with Eugene England, right? Something like that. Well, I think maybe need to write your own article or your own, give your own symposium on Eugene from your point of view. Seriously.
It is coming.
That would be incredible.
There have been, I think, 3 collections about Gene, reflections about Gene and your relationships with him that have come out in the years since he died. One still coming out now that I think Bob Reese edited, that I have had the opportunity to write for, and have said, I'm submitting something. And as the date gets near, I just don't submit anything. And Greg and I have talked about this a lot over the years. Allison submitted something. It's really lovely. It's too complicated and too close and too painful and there's a lot of darkness there. And there is an essay. I was going through my notes today before we spoke, notes that I've made about the essay I want to write about Gene over the years. It's going to come out, but it's going to be a hard one, and you'll see why if we talk further. But I'm saying this because I think that there's I noticed that in Terrell Givens' biography, we were never contacted. Now, I know that there are a million people in the world who think Gene England was really their buddy. And there are a lot of people who actually were his buddy, and Gene had the capacity to be friends with a million people. I am in no way claiming privilege, but Greg and I were in his life, at his house, with his family, on his London trip, at the basketball games, doing everything, going on hiking trips with him for years.
Intimately connected. Maxine Hanks, who was there with you at the same era, she shared a long version and a short version of an essay that she had written about, Eugene, for I think one of these things that you're talking about. But exactly, those of you that were intimately connected, you have those stories no one else can know. I mean, they're just wonderful. They're just incredible.
I've wondered why neither Terrell nor the other person whose name I'm forgetting didn't. And maybe it's just that they weren't aware of it because there's no reference in there. But there's a part of his London experience, but we were there, and that doesn't square with the London experience I had. There's an inside version of that is not being told, and I just feel like if we're going to have a biography of Gene, my gosh, that's a document that needs to be thorough and honest. And I just don't understand why nobody ever contacted me or Greg to talk to us about it. Allison says to me, she was at a symposium once when they were talking about gathering materials for Eugene England biography, and she raised her hand and said, hey, if you want to get this chapter of Gene's life, you should talk to my brothers. And they didn't.
Maybe they don't want that close of a look, because it's representative of the church at that time. I mean, a certain part of the church, maybe they don't want that close of a look. I don't know. But I do. So please write your article. Please do what you need to do. Because I caught the very tail end when I was there in the mid to late 80s. So, but yeah, it was wonderful.
Let me reference this. And so that if we don't, which is totally fine, don't keep returning to a kind of focus on Gene and that part of it. Just say, I saw Gene when I left. One of my great regrets in my life is that I didn't go to Gene's funeral. I was in Oberlin. I just started teaching there. And for a lot of reasons that would be part of the larger story at the time, I felt like it somehow didn't make sense, but now I can't believe I thought that. The fact that he died just before 9/11 is, for anyone who knew him, a profoundly ironic thing. But I do remember the last experiences I had with him, and one of the very last involved me sitting with him when he was packing up the office at BYU he had because he had been kicked out of BYU. And he told me about what happened with Jeff Holland and with Dallin Oaks, and what promises had been made to him by them to his face, and how they had been broken and he had been betrayed and deceived. And there was a side of Gene that came out then that I'd never ever seen before, and it was darkness. Something that no one talks about really very much. And so part of why my essay on Gene England, which is what the working title is that mine doesn't begin with he was the most awesome guy in the world, because he was. That goes without saying. Everybody speaks about how influential he was. But, my relationship started with Gene when he started talking about how do you justify theodicy, the existence of evil in the world with a good God, went through it's okay if you leave the church. In fact, it might be the right thing. And ending with an anger and a bitterness and a darkness coming out of him at people in the church that I had never seen nor heard of from anyone else. Now, I'm sure Charlotte and all the kids and the family say, wait, he doesn't know. You're right, I don't know. I'm just talking about me and the world I lived in and my experience with him and what everyone else ever said. And was I a child of Gene? No. Was I his spouse? No. But my world was very close to Gene as a mentee and someone he became a surrogate father. Absolutely. He took what my dad had done and took it way farther, just as then Wayne Booth took what Gene had done and took that way farther. And I attribute that to them. And Gene was... I can anyway. It's
we can do a whole other episode, but I think that we should, because Landon probably isn't familiar with the scenario. What did happen? I mean, and I think the anger you talk about is probably for decades. You've got to keep so much in when you're working at BYU, and he, of course, could be more nuanced. He could express that, but still, in the end, it comes down to that moment, and maybe you can just
the London experience at the end that sort of blew things up, that began the explosion based on which he was booted from BYU. A big piece that fueled it then, and I'm sure anyone who went on that London trip, and Charlotte and family, or if they're listening, I'm sure this is their with bated breath. Part of that is because Greg and I were, Jeff Holland came over as BYU's president to visit that London abroad at the end of the term. We remember him coming in and sitting at our table and having dinner with us. There's a lot more to say about that, but the fact that his two TAs didn't even go to church didn't help. The fact that he interviewed a bunch of students, and some of them, the few more conservative students who I think probably were pretty disapproving of me and Greg, though I think a lot of them have been my friends for life. But we were honestly struggling to believe what we believed. We weren't trying to provoke or hurt anybody. We were good academic leaders, but in the church, no. That got Gene in a lot of trouble because they said, we're here and these TAs don't even go to church. There's no spirit here. What can we? And I felt, then we went as often happens, that we TAs went off and traveled on the continent with a bunch of different groups of students. And somehow, these rumors started that Greg and I were off leading students astray and breaking their faith and giving them cocaine and all these rumors, and none of that was true. I will cop right here publicly to saying the first time I ever tasted alcohol was at a Spanish flamenco thing in Madrid when I was on study abroad. But I wasn't a drinker and I wasn't a drug dealer and I wasn't a taker, but that happened. But that started. And so when Jeff Holland got word of all this stuff coming back,
right,
about, oh, Eugene England, we send him on a study abroad and he doesn't even take leaders who believe in the church or go to church, and they take the students off and lose their testimonies. That's the last time Gene's ever gone to England. And when I heard that was Gene was never going to be supported to go to England again, even though he did in a mini way later, that broke my heart because I knew how much that meant to Gene. And Greg and I both, to this day, I feel profound regret and shame about screwing up something that meant so much to Gene. And if I could see Gene right now, I apologize to him then, but that would be the first thing that I would want to say to him. I would say, my friend, my brother, my father figure, I am so sorry because I know how much that meant to you. And, you never did anything except support me. And I feel really bad about that. That I would have been more careful. I couldn't foresee what my actions.
Right. How could you have known? How could you have known? I mean, you're just
know,
following your path. And because you're not completely believing, suddenly you're giving cocaine to students, or do you know what I mean? That's where it goes. There's no spirit here. Yeah, it's typical.
Yes,
absolutely.
and just for the
typical.
record, I've never given cocaine to students. That's never happened.
Yes, so, let's make this clear. That is not why we're having Geoff on the program.
Oh let's bracket that. Just say Gene was an important influence during that whole period. But then when I am in Chicago and through grad school, all these things changed. First time I drank, first time I smoked pot, first time I had sex, and it was with someone, got involved with someone who was married at the time. Oh my gosh, I'm involved with a married woman. I had to go to therapy.
You're being an adult.
I'm the first person going to therapy in my family because I thought my world was going to explode. She was Catholic and married. I was Mormon, and our collective guilt sunk that relationship like that. And it just began this whole sort of like thing that if you wanted to measure my life on Mormon standards, it was a colossal going off the rails and into tragic.
Of course.
Darkness.
And you're the stereotype. Yeah, of course that's going to happen. All those things are going to happen. And you're going to end up in therapy because you've walked away. Instead, you're just starting to live your life, and figuring it out.
And if you want to, take this trajectory I've charted through my family and my dad and Eugene England and Wade Booth in grad school, what I realized when I made my film some 20 years later is what changed is the protagonist in my life went from being certainty to uncertainty. Because in the academic world, in the university, if you're really a university, uncertainty and questions and critical thinking is the core. It is the principle. You must question everything. That's how you learn. You come to truth through, what does the Book of Mormon say? Opposition in all things. That's why paradox is such a sacred concept to me. There is an other side to everything. Nothing is exactly what it seems. Nothing. We can't pretend that anything that means something is that. And so in my film, uncertainty emerges as the protagonist. Right? That's what threatens the people in Guatemala. That's what doesn't square for them. They're like, you're in or you're out. I'll pray for you to come back. I'm carrying uncertainty. And when I'm teaching my students, that's all I teach them. Question everything. First day of class, my role here is to knock you off balance, to make you question everything. That's the narrative of my life. And so my relationship with Mormonism, you get me in the right pocket of experience, and I am as dark and as bitter and angry and as fuck you as anyone you will find, I promise you. Because when I see that happening to people being sort of abused spiritually or deceived or, drowning in shame, I'm really angry about that. But nor can I deny, on the other hand, that my life is so intertwined with good people who are Mormons and their courage and honesty that it's silly for me to look and say, well, the church is just a bad thing. No, my gosh, it involves millions of people and it's an organization over centuries, and how silly to reduce it to that. But from any point of view, it's just silly. You have to look at a person's life and say, where does this come into play? But the church is not a single thing. And that's part of the question here, right? It's not a single thing. And I know what I try to do in my film, we're not talking about it, is be careful with things that you can't just reduce to a single thing, and respect the different ways they can be understood and experienced, and then you'll be okay. Be honest but respectful. And that film didn't include hardly any of my real anger towards the church or any of the more kind of horrible things that I would say happened, but it went to the core of it, which is, this ain't going to work for me. It just doesn't allow the world to be what my world is. It's the whole fit question. If all you feel every day and experience is the kind of shape of your open-ended doubt, and all you live is in a world where the narrative repeatedly and insistently and with great price is, it must be certain, it must conclude, if you do this, it will work out.
Right.
How does that fit?
Well, it doesn't fit because it never does work out. And then you're left with those overwhelming feelings of, what did I do or what happened? So I thought it was interesting when we first met you, Landon and I were kind of like, oh, he seems like he's been removed from Mormonism for a very long time. Like, if you remember when we first connected, Landon and I would say things like, oh, what about this? And you're like, I'm not really following, you weren't immersed in it like some of us are. So do you feel like now maybe you're almost pulled back in now that more people know about your film, they're talking to you, you're talking to us? I mean, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, both Landon and I think we've kind of said, oh, it must be so nice. He seems like he's very removed. He's not like battling this day by day like we kind of feel we are. So I wonder if that was accurate. Were you removed, and now do you feel like you're a little more in now that you're interacting more, or or do you just want to run away?
If I show up to Salt Lake at my parents' house and some certain extended relatives are going to show up for a family thing, and they're, on the political scale, different from mine, and they're very conservative Mormons, and they think that I'm a lost soul. Yes. Yeah, I want to run away. I don't want to be at that gathering. And in fact, I do. I usually just go, though I've tried to not. That's the shame I carry. Why should I feel shamed because I made a choice? What's wrong with me? Why am I not angry at them for being so ridiculously judgmental? But that's how that works. Those things are deep. If, on the other hand, but I think my better answer is, I feel like I have returned to connection with a community of Mormons that did not really exist extensively when I left.
Interesting.
Because this middle post-Mormon, ex-Mormon, making my film and pushing it on social media, one of the most revealing things is, oh my gosh, there are so many people in the world who are ex-post something beyond Mormons, former Mormons. Back then, it just felt, and so I think the thing we talk about, like, give it a century and we'll be like the Jews or the Catholics, where there's, Jewish Reform, Orthodox, conservative.
Cultural, exactly, liberal.
You don't have to believe literally to be okay in those faiths. Mormonism is slowly widening horizontally so that there probably are eventually going to be places where, I'm a Mormon, but I'm a liberal Mormon. I'm a post-Mormon, still whatever. And it won't come under direct condemnation by the doctrine of the church or something like that. I don't know. Churches are organizations. Organizations protect themselves to survive. It is no different than any other in that respect. That explains a lot.
Did it surprise you at the premiere of your movie that we did in Salt Lake, the number of people who stood up and shared with you their experiences and how much your film related to them? Did that surprise you when you say that there weren't so many at the time when you left? Did it surprise you at that point, or had you already kind of began to notice that prior? Because I felt it was very moving. A lot of the comments, people were literally crying.
People were in tears. They were so overwhelmed and sharing their stories of, how they could relate to the film about the mission, and sharing how they lost community after leaving. It was very emotional. Absolutely.
I think the single most striking feeling I had was the last thing you said, which was, I had no idea that so many people who went on a mission once and have had any degree of dissonance with the church, whether it be internal doubts or full on, I'm out, middle finger, valued relationships in their mission that they had to kind of closet away shamefully afterwards because they couldn't represent themselves except as fallen, tragic, failed figures. So I had no idea that, and it kind of, in thinking about it, I think, why didn't I have that idea? It seems pretty obvious, but I was struck because my experience, if I want to be a little reductive, is I went to screen my movie in Salt Lake for the Mormon community for the first time, 2+ years after it came out. And I felt like the whole night was going from one person to another, and every person I encountered had to tell me their story. It wasn't my story, it was their story. My movie
was this Sunstone? Was this when you screened it at Sunstone?
The one I did
ours. Oh, okay. I thought you said the first time. Oh, so you are talking about ours. The first time I
screened,
okay.
It screened at remote online Zoomed Sunstones, and I don't really consider.
Okay.
So it did prior, but the first time the movie was shown in a theater with a whole bunch of Mormons sitting there.
Okay. This was ours in February. Okay. All right. Continue. I just want to make sure I understood. Yeah. No, I agree. I saw everyone was in a line to talk to Geoff. Like, we couldn't get out of the theater. They needed us to move to the lobby.
Kept telling us to move, and no one would move.
Yeah, it was like you were this figure that understood where no one else had understood them. It was incredible.
It's interesting because, you know, my distributor is called Good Docs in Los Angeles, and they get responses from people who look at the film or buy it, and they've passed them along to me. And I've gotten a couple of incredibly bitter, scathing responses from people always practicing Mormons whose position is largely, why is everyone so negative about the church? Why can't he go on his mission and leave these people alone and let him be happy? He's just so negative. You know, and the first thing I think is, well, A, she didn't watch the film.
Yeah,
because it's not negative.
Anyone could watch it.
It is not negative. No, and we're going to link this film. It's on Amazon Prime. You can just rent it. It's the most positive, incredible, accurate. You're just going to have to watch it, everybody. Trust me. It was incredible.
I would just say, if you want to watch it, Amazon Prime, if you're a single viewer or a family, if you're an institution and you're interested, just go to Good Docs, Google them on the internet. That's where you get the license to watch the film, and they'll be happy to give it to you. But it's, no. And so in that sense, it's weird. I think that there was a space there that most people didn't know about, which was, that I didn't know about until I went and made the film, which was, they're not all just happy that I've left the church. In fact, they're saying things that reflect that they're not happy. They're brokenhearted and hope and pray I'll come back. But they still have a real connection to me. And any friendship that I formed there is still alive. And there's kind of a space to be in if all parties in good faith want it. That's the crucial thing, is that all parties in good faith must want it. So when someone who leaves the church is disowned by their family, what's happening there? Well, the first thing that's happening is the people who are disowning the person who left are choosing fear over love. And I'm not saying that like it's an easy thing, because there are big moments in all of our lives, mine included, when I have chosen fear over love. Fear is really tempting. Fear grabs your anxiety. Fear makes you think the worst. Fear plays on your deepest, earliest narratives, the most powerful ones. My dad, we'll never be together again. You have to come back. So, but eventually people work their way through it if they have courage and honesty and love to say, no, I prefer to have love. I am not selling my religion out to love my child who left the church. I'm not selling Jesus out. That's simply not the case. And again, if you believe that, then that's your belief. But you watch my film, you hear me now. I know it's with me from Mormonism. It's real simple. A version of love is the answer. That is what's with me from Mormonism. Period. End of sentence. And if you don't want that, then we don't have a lot in common about Mormonism, because that is what I took away from it that still defines me and still is in my heart. It's not about like prosecution and rules and this and that and exclusion and inclusion and judgment. It's just not. Sorry, I'm not an Old Testament Mormon. I'm about mercy. And you know, it's so to me, you have to work your way through that. And I think my relationship with this post-Mormon community, the space I found after the film, when I got none of the answers that I kind of hoped I would get, though I couldn't define them, which is something that would put this all to rest. Nothing has been put to rest, but I do feel like a community opened up of people who also aren't comfortable in the church, but also have been deeply shaped by the church. And no matter how you slice that, it's complicated. And no matter how you slice that, there are human casualties. No matter how you slice it, there are relationships that come under great duress. And so afterwards, when we were talking previously about what to talk about on this podcast, we're finally getting to the podcast topic here.
The topic is happening now.
It's happening now. Just scroll to minute whatever we're at. What do you do with relationships with important people with family relationships, with meaningful relationships of any kind. What do you do with those relationships when they were forged or shaped through shared belief, and you now don't have the same beliefs? That's a real problem. And at the most explicit level, it's the parents who angrily throw the kid out because the kid said, I'm gay. At the most subtle level, it's more like what happened in my life, where it's not as harsh, it's not as judgmental, it's not throwing you out, but it still means that everything that we've ever gone through together is kind of adjusted. And you have to refigure out what your family is and how you connect. Part of why my family now, the children, my parents had their 65th wedding anniversary not too long before my dad died. And on the way home, I was in the car with my mom and dad, and my mom said, what was your favorite thing about it, to my dad? And he said, without hesitation, that all 6 of my kids love and respect each other. And I think that's kind of where we are, but that's the result of probably a decade of working through stuff, right? When we all left the church, it wasn't all of us leaving. There was only Greg and I were kind of the first ones out. Mark, but he was on a later time frame. He was the cleanest. But the other, Allison and Matt, it's been slower. It's very complicated. And so, I think it's easy to kind of, for me to gloss over it because it happened in such a soft, kind of nuanced way. But for people who are literally one day in my family for 18 years, my parents, my siblings, and the next day I'm looking for a motel with my bags and they won't take my phone calls. I don't know that experience.
No, and that's a reality, though. That's a reality that we've heard from people. It really is. Oh,
well, and it's super heartbreaking. But if you think about it, it's just so silly that what people believe. I was recently actually having at the office of a holistic healer I have back issues, and he was working on me. And when he works on my body, he talks to me. And I refer to him, Greg and I refer to him kind of jokingly as the healer, because you go in there and you always come out in a good mood, no matter how bad your mood is. He's in Salt Lake. You should take his number. Last time I was there, and without fail, when I leave his office, his place and the table, I think, why didn't I have a tape recorder on? I want to remember everything we talked about. And the last time I was there, I said, I mentioned that, and he said, nothing that matters do you need to record or write down. You've got it. The body keeps the score. You remember it. And I thought a lot about that. That's its own path of conversation. But I'm saying this because when I was in there, I thought about this, and I thought, we were talking, he said, what do you think the nature of God is? And I said, I don't know. But if I had to give you a short answer of what is God, what's God like, it would be the following: a sum of the best actions, qualities, thoughts, behaviors I've ever seen in people I admire. That's it. And those people are people like my dad and Eugene England and Wayne Booth, where kindness is the answer, respect is the answer, never harsh judgment. It doesn't mean you can't say a hard thing to someone, but it's a different thing to say, I don't agree with you, and because of that, I cease to acknowledge you as a human being, right? So that, to me, any sense of God there, and I thought, where does that come from? It comes from our relationships up. It's a ground up approach. Whereas organizations like the church and people in power, it's all a top down approach to manage from above the individuals that support and keep your large structured organization alive. And I don't say that that's how organizations work, Mormon or otherwise. They're not humans. They don't have a conscience. So they survive. And so if you're managing that, at a certain point, every individual will have to make a decision between this tension of individual versus organization. They don't coincide easily. That I learned at BYU too, from Bonner Ritchie and Hal Miller and Eugene England. And so, excuse me, to me, it kind of comes down to, are you going to choose an organization, or are you going to choose relationships and how you treat people? And there are times in personal relationships where there's no easy choice. It's not obviously right or wrong. I mean, that's what you learn as you become an adult. That's one of the most valuable things Eugene England taught me. He used to over-assign us so much that one day after class, Greg and I approached him furiously, almost in tears, saying, you give us way too much. We can never do all the assignments. What are you doing? And instead of responding, he started to laugh. We were so angry at him. And he said, and now I do this with my students. He said, yeah, well, part of the job here is for you to have to choose things, to have to let it go, because life isn't about an evil act versus a good act. Those aren't the hard decisions we make. The hard decisions are always between a good and a good. And you're learning that you're not going to get all your reading done for this class. You're not going to be able to be a perfectly check it all the boxes student. That's part of the game. And at the time, I was really pissed off at him. But I'm really happy about that now. Anyway, sorry, back to this. So I don't know. I feel like I've now wandered off again from our topic.
No. I was going to ask you about the idea. You said sort of a fear when families cut somebody off. And I think that has to do with the concept of the afterlife. You talked about that before. And I had an experience in college right at 85-ish where I was dating someone. He left on a mission, decided it wasn't for him. He left the MTC, basically. He was only there for a couple of weeks and decided, no, I'm going to leave. So his family, as the girlfriend, called me and said, we've cut him off and disowned him. We'd like you to do this too, because this will force him to go back. No, I mean, I understood. It was a place of love. But they had cut him off. They wouldn't take his calls like you described. They would give him no money. He had nothing but his missionary suitcase, and they wanted me to do the same thing so that would force him to make the right choice so that he could be with them forever. It was a place of fear completely. Of course, I didn't do that. I helped him find an apartment. He got a job at 7-Eleven at midnight. He's still active in the church. He's since reconciled with his family and everything. But that just struck me. I mean, that was my first real world experience with a family that said, hello, we've cut him off and you should too. I mean, it was just so shocking to me. It helped me kind of solidify my own feelings. I thought I would never do that to anyone, but I understood it was fear. That we have to use tough love now because we've got to get him into that celestial
they were
realm
basically
with us.
They were enlisting you in a spiritual intervention.
Yeah, right? It was a spiritual intervention. Absolutely. Yep. If he has nothing, if he's on a park bench, he's going to go the only place he has, and that's the MTC. He'll come to his senses, and then, but he's married in the temple. He has children. He's still in the church. They had nothing to worry about. But yeah, that was a real awakening. They even went as far as arranging for us to go talk to a general authority who yelled at us from his, to try to get us back into, it was a big deal, a pivotal event, I would say, in my life. I've talked about it several times. Our viewers and listeners will know, but I do think there's that fear. If you believe in that afterlife, like you said, and you're not going to be there with your family, that's the devastation. That's the ultimate, just devastation in everyone's life. So I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about that. To me, that's a big reality.
To bring it around to where we started with what Landon said about, I said fear or love. And to me, the love is something that's easy to cultivate and where you can cultivate through individual relationships, ground up. Fear is a much easier byproduct of organizational thinking and decision-making because it's executive action. It's from a top to control. Power in people's lives is always about lateral control, how to do it. But only the wisest people understand that more power doesn't make you happy. Donald Trump thinks it does. Business leaders think it do. Military people sometimes think it does. But it doesn't. Power is about letting go. It's like if you're a good teacher. With my students, my job is to empower them to oppose me, not to be like me. My job is to empower them to be independent thinkers. If they choose to agree with me, that's their choice. But it's just as good an outcome, and it's a more obviously successful outcome if I teach them, and what they take away is that I don't have to agree with Pingree at all. Right? That's what you want, and that's not what happens in the church. And so, at least not at all. Usually.
No.
And so sorry, go ahead, Landon.
I was going to say, what a great thought, because
that's
church
amazing.
is all about power. And you just really nailed it. That really life is all about empowering, not gaining power, but empowering others.
That's what it is, and that was a big shift in my teaching career when I realized that my model when I was at BYU was there were teachers I had who were fascinating and smart, and I just wanted to be like them, and they had all these kind of devotees, followers. Gene had 1 million of them, but he never, and I realized that I could be very charismatic in a classroom, and a lot of students were just like, hey, Pingree, I want to be like him, because anyone who's taught, if they're honest, knows teaching is like performance. It's theater. And you go in there and you're on, and you have to own that. It's great that the rush is awesome, but you got to take responsibility for it. And at a certain point, I thought, I have all these students who like me and they want to be like me, but is that really what's best for them? And I changed. And, there's a talk that, again, Wayne Booth gave when he was president of the Modern Language Association, where he addresses this and says, our best outcome is that our students oppose us, because that's where you're really teaching them, because you're empowering them, not yourself. And that is the core of teaching for me. And I think it's kind of the core of relationships. So nowadays we talk about power. Power's toxic, power imbalance. No, the power is not inherently anything. It can be abused and it can be used for constructive ends. And, that's the focus for me, is how are you using the power that you have? Because there's not a human being alive that doesn't have some power sometime. And there are plenty who are alive who have massive amounts who use it wisely. Not very often, but it sometimes happens. And so, I just think this choice, I think what's happening right now, this middle layer of post-formal Mormons, is something that only can exist when there are enough people and enough experience and enough outcry and enough stepping up and speaking for yourself, that it forces a space that a fully controlling and in-charge organization would never permit. Right? Wow. The Catholic Church changed. Judaism changed, not because it shows that as the wisest pathway, but because organizations are forced to change when they realize that they will lose their membership and support if they don't adjust to what that membership needs. And so it is still a strategic decision, but one of the outcomes is positive for individuals. It's why I say this way of thinking, to me, is the only way to deal with where we are politically. I can't go near sanctioning and supporting so many things that I hear from people on the right politically, but I can go and, as their neighbor, help them fix their fence and take them bread and be nice and have a fun conversation. I can get into it, and I can find their goodness there too. Like declare yourself globally, but act locally. Think globally, act locally. You got to act locally, because that's where this comes from. And to me, churches, come on, where are they acting from? They act from the top down. And that is what, to me, the shift that has happened over these past few years. The good being, there's an element of the church that has forced an openness to something. But the bad thing is the church has doubled down in so many ridiculous ways. They've eliminated all these activities that allow people to have a more complex human experience, like church sports, road shows, dance festival. Boys, it's all gone. My mom says
no community whatsoever.
At church now, they have what, MIA, what it used to be for me. I spent 4 days a week.
MIA.
And believe me, very little of that was theological or doctrinal.
No.
Yeah, MIA is now MIA.
MIA is MIA. That's right. When I was a kid, we'd go water skiing. That was MIA. Let's everybody meet at the river. And then they came up with this thing called the priesthood purpose. So every activity had to have that. And then it was just a slow death. But I love the concept. And I think post-Mormons, former Mormons, ex-Mormons, we try to think that, why can't we leave it alone? Because we care about everybody in the organization. And sometimes change in a top-down organization can only come from the outside as they react to things. And it's almost a joke. You'll see post-Mormons really hitting an issue, drawing it to the forefront. Suddenly there'll be a change. Sam Young is probably one of the biggest examples of that. Protect children, change youth interviews. I mean, that was cause and effect. There's no way that you can't say that didn't happen. Of course, he was excommunicated. People have to put their head on the chopping block for that. But people inside can't do that. I know they think they can. I know they try, but it really takes an outsider to come in with a great outcry. So, but the landscape is completely different. Like you say, it is.
People who pay that price. I mean, I remember one of the things that was most unsettling to me about the September 7 was half of them were my friends and colleagues at the 70s press. And the only reason this isn't happening to me is because I don't go to any of that stuff.
Exactly.
It just disappeared. I left. I'm off the map. It's amazing what happens if you need to make your voice heard. You put it on social media. You can say so little and get so much trouble. And you can go out there and not ever talk about it to a Mormon and say much worse things. But if they don't know, they don't care. And
and
so something like Maxine Hanks tremendously, because she paid a huge price.
I know she did. I saw that. Gosh, you should come. Well, you'll be out of town. You'll be out of the country. But at Sunstone, which is happening the last week of July, the very end of July, I was reading the schedule yesterday because Landon and I are going to go for sure. There's a panel to reunite the September 6th, September 7th, and 7, and have them talk about that era. So I'm like, I got that circled right there for sure. That's
not going to do a
amazing.
Zoom component of any of it.
I don't know. I think there is a Zoom component to it. I was trying to read through that. So, because, oh my gosh, so many good things, but that one right there would be good. I'll find out and I'll let you know because, that would definitely be, like you said, those were all your best friends at the 7th East.
I was going to say, Landon, you can edit this out if you need to, but I'm formally publicly requesting a Zoom component to Sunstone for people like me who can't be there physically. I want to attend and comment on that.
I agree. No, I agree. That would be amazing. And I think they are trying, because doesn't it say in the schedule, Landon, it says something like, it says something that leads me to believe that they're planning that. So
yeah, they had, I know during the COVID years and stuff, they were doing some of that. So I think they may have carried that over.
They'd be crazy not to. I mean, everybody wants to attend. Not everybody can be right there. Yeah. Unless you want to fly back early, right?
Yeah.
Come hang out with us again in Utah.
I'd love to do that. Actually.
Yeah, it's the very last day of July. It's like 27th, 28th, 29th. It's the very end. So,
well, one other thing I would suggest, since I know they do this all well in advance, is we should think about having a panel on this topic.
Absolutely.
What happens to important relationships forged through the church when members of those relationships leave the church? Maybe that's the title right there. Because we hit it in a lot of different tangential ways, but that post-screening conversation, which went away from me so quickly, I went in there fearing, oh no, there's going to be a bunch of ex-Mormons who are going to come in angry, and it's going to be a lot of emotional high anger at the church, anger at me for being so soft, anger at Sandra Tanner was there. My gosh. And there was no anger.
Maxine was there, although you didn't get to connect. Yeah, everybody was there.
No, so instead it was like this group therapy healing session of so sad. I haven't thought about these people in 20 years. And as I think about them, it breaks my heart. They just disappeared because I left the church. That's the topic to explore, because so many people, it resonates with them. And not just resonates, but seems to touch something that hasn't been touched, like it got forgotten in the closet for 20 years.
Yes. Yeah, in some cases, it's too painful, I think, and you just kind of gravitate away and you don't know what to say. But it's still there. I mean, eventually you're going to revisit it one way or another, I think. But yeah, and I think there are different groups. I mean, you have people that help people who are having trouble, where marriages are breaking up, or families or friends. But you're right. As an overall concept, there really needs to be more done with that to support, because it's a reality, I don't know. We all live in different places. So I deal with it by not really telling people where I'm at. And that's probably being a coward, but my parents don't have any idea that I'm out. My sibling, no idea. My friends maybe get the idea something's up, but I've certainly never made a declaration. And I wouldn't say it's fear of losing people, because I've almost lost them even more by not being that no one knows my authentic self. I've literally lost them even more because they do not know who I am. They do not know what I'm doing, what I care about, what I'm passionate about. They don't know my new world, my new friends, so they know nothing. So I have already lost them, even though physically I'm not dealing with that disappointment in their eyes. I've lost them, if that makes any kind of sense.
That's what one eventually gets, isn't it? If you avoid it long enough, you get the thing you feared in greater proportion.
Yeah, and that's exactly right.
It's fascinating, because I was going to say, don't they listen to the podcast? Don't they? Obviously, they.
It's a hidden world.
It's a chosen. It's also a chosen. It's a collaborative act of avoidance.
Yes. And that's true too. Yep. Don't ask, don't tell. I mean, my young adult children who have discovered it, it's a don't ask, don't tell. They don't want to know what mom's doing because they're within the church. And so it's just too disturbing. It's that kind of thing. So it's a don't ask, don't tell. But then Landon's the opposite of me. He's made declarations and announcements, and your situation's a little different, isn't it, Landon?
Yeah, but I still come back to avoidance because whenever we get together, then, it's always uncomfortable because we're all trying to avoid talking about, the elephant in the room, it seems like, and you never feel authentic. You feel like you're just talking to be nice, not to find out about each other.
Yeah.
And there's a level of avoidance because every family has emotional truths that no one can perfectly and fully address. It just isn't in us. but you can get closer to it. And I'd say on religious matters, my family went through an evolution and a development that I'm very proud of, and that we can talk about anything directly, although at times it's uncomfortable. There's still emotional things we don't talk about, and in that sense, you see it in every family. But they're so tied up, and I agree. You have to identify the things that matter to you the most in life, and then confront those things, because late in my dad's life, we were having Sunday dinner. So again, I'm visiting him in Salt Lake and kind of living there at the time for reasons. And my mom and dad are both there. And my mom's sister is there. And she's a very straight, toe the line practicing Mormon. And my brother Tim and his wife are there, just about to go on their mission. They're there, or at least, I can't remember if it's that soon, but they're soon to be mission presidents. And then I'm there. And my dad, for some reason, gets fixated on this thing that in church that day at testimony meeting, one of his friends came up to him afterwards and started talking to him about his children. My dad got on this thing about how, and a couple of my sons are leaving. They're betraying us. They're leaving the church. They're leaving the fold. Don't know what to bring them back. They won't listen. And his friends said things that got fueled. And so somehow my dad, again, I'm saying this because I think the science supports it. This is something that he wouldn't have processed this way 20 years younger. He goes home. He's fixated on it. He starts talking to me about it. Before dinner, we drop it. We have dinner. We're all sitting at the table. My dad at the end, my Aunt Suzanne, my brother and his wife, all practicing Mormons, my mom over here, and me. And he can't stop talking about how I am just, letting the family down. I'm betraying everything. What's he going to do? I'm leaving the church. I'm like the Korah whore, whatever. He's going on and on about this. And I kind of understand why he's saying it now, but him doing that in a public way like that, we were all dead silent.
Yeah, what can you say?
The most embarrassing. Even the practicing Mormons felt terrible for me because he went off for half an hour on me. And afterwards, I went around and I said to my mom, I said, Dad's never, ever, ever done that to me before. I feel like he's sold me out in a way that would never have happened 10 years ago. And I'm hurt in a way that I've never been hurt by him. But anyway, I felt really wounded for about a week. And then when my sister came to town, she's a great facilitator. We went back, I told her about it. We went and sat down and talked to him about it and confronted him. And he couldn't remember half of it.
Oh, yeah.
To the question of how did you feel? He could never give an answer because he doesn't know how to talk about his feelings. And he just kept saying, no, well, Geoff was saying this. And Allison kept saying, but Dad, how did you feel when Geoff said that? How did you feel? Couldn't answer emotionally. Well, I just, it was important because I said, Dad, you really hurt me. I don't know why you said that. You embarrassed and humiliated me in front of people because you wouldn't let it go. And you just kept beating on me. And no one said a word. And it was deadly silent. Didn't you get it? Well, his full 86-year-old diminished capacity was on full display. He didn't remember half of it. He was trying to reason. And Allison and I just realized, okay, this isn't one, as my therapist has said to me, certain problems, once you hit a certain age or they hit a certain age, you don't try and solve them because they can't. You let it go. You accept that dissonance exists and you just make peace with what's possible. And he couldn't. And so, but that is a really outlier of a moment in my life. Wow. I'd never had that happen to me before. And it was really painful. Yeah. So
and I think no, it isn't. I think probably in your dad's mind, that's something that maybe rose to the surface that had never for him before. Like, because I see that with my own dad, that just things that weren't there on the surface before, now for some reason they are. And you don't know if that's really them or what they really think. You're not sure. So I give the benefit of the doubt.
I give the benefit of the doubt to the younger, more full-minded person. And I think, again, when you're under the pressures that age put on you, the world narrows, you return to childhood, and you hang on to things. And that means you reduce things, you narrow, you make them black and white. You don't complexify, you don't complicate, you narrow. And I think at that point, what my dad was basically saying is, I'm terrified, even though he was talking about no testimony, leaving the church, what's going on, my sons are abandoning us. What he was really saying is, I am terrified I won't ever see him again.
Yes.
When I die.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I get that. I hear that.
Yep.
So.
Yep. Mormonism stays with you for your entire life, right? I think about my grandfather who had very diminished capacity at the very end, about a similar age. And pretty much the only thing left in his head that he would say to us, and I've said this before, is, and this comes from years of presiding, we'd say, "Bye, Grandpa." And he'd go, "Make sure that you put away the chairs and tables in the cultural hall, and let's make sure that we sweep the floor." I mean, he was just, that was what was in his head. That's what he would, years of presiding over meetings and activities. And he would say that to us as we left, which to me it was really sad. It's like, that's what's left there, just this presiding administrator in the church telling us to put the chairs and tables back and make the room nice for the next meeting. And
you hit it on the head. I mean,
yeah.
When we did my dad's funeral, I stood there, and with the iPad, bringing all my siblings in, my mom and I guess Matt had arrived. We put things into the coffin by their request. There wasn't a Bible. There wasn't a scripture. There wasn't a Jesus saves us all. There was a St. Louis Cardinals baseball hat that he had with Greg. There was a Indian guide's necklace he had when we were little kids with us. It was a Boy Scout thing he did with us. There was a thing I got with him when I took him to Antarctica. There was a anti-racist postcard. There was nothing gospel or doctrinal put in his coffin with him. I'm not saying he didn't believe those things. I'm saying these were the things that bound us.
Right.
Not preaching about the church doctrine. It was the experiences we shared. And but the funeral was held in the framework of a Mormon bishop presiding. Stuff.
Yeah.
And by the end, I felt like I was in foreign territory. I was in somebody else's house having our family funeral.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's a whole nother topic too. Yeah, that is. And when your family member wants that, you have to go along with it. But you certainly feel very disconnected, and you feel like it's not really even about the person. So, and now Landon and I always talk about this, like, now, how do we get our, my children, his children, to throw the kind of funeral we want? I guess, and then you think, well, that put your children at odds. I have some in, some out, will they then be at odds over that? It's even end of life, even after life, there's these components that you're still going to butt heads over. I know. I keep saying to I have one son that's out. I keep saying, do not let anyone put me in temple clothes. That is not what but then I say, what a terrible position to put him in, because then my other sons may say, no, I know that now mom understands. Now she's somewhere, so and Post-Mormons do talk about this, do you write this down? Do you make sort of a living will about absolute wishes? But, there's no guarantee, and you just put your kids at odds against each other. So again, we're still concerned in death, even after life. So I don't know. There's no end.
No one in our family, my mom now included, who's 87, has written out specific wishes for their funeral. But my dad had done it years and years before. He knew exactly what he wanted. And he wanted this song and this thing, but what he wanted mostly was for each child to speak without limited time and to say whatever they needed to say.
Wow.
And he got it. Because you heard a whole wide spectrum on the church in that funeral. And he wanted his pallbearers to be his female grandchildren.
Wow. Your dad was very progressive. That's amazing.
He called women assistants as a mission president in Ecuador. And anyway, but there weren't all female pallbearers because of COVID, but there were at least a couple.
Oh, at least a couple.
But
anyway, he could be there.
My point is,
that's amazing.
He knew in planning his funeral, he knew exactly what was going to happen.
Right.
We were at the church for decades. He knew exactly what that was going to be like. And so he wasn't doing it thinking it was going to make us conform. He wanted to say, here they are. This is who they are. And this is what my family is. And I'm not hiding it. You just heard them. That's their take on the world. Right.
Wow.
So it was pretty interesting.
That's amazing. Gosh, your family, I think we could listen to stories, don't you think, Landon, of his family forever? You need to write a book. You need to make another documentary. You need to do all of this. So my goodness. Well, I think we're up against, I don't even know what time it is. I've just been riveted and fascinated this whole time, but I still feel like we need to have Geoff on again, because now I have even more questions. I know, this is just incredible. It's just amazing. And I hope our viewers and listeners just got even a small sense of who Geoff is, and the experiences that he's had and the lives that he has intersected with. I mean, I don't even think we scratched the surface on that, but especially your stories of the BYU years, just absolutely fascinating. And I'm so excited that you're going to do some kind of treatment of Eugene England's life. So if our viewers and listeners have not ever become acquainted with Eugene England, just just jump online. There's so many wonderful things that he's written and so many things written about him. And he's just, we spend our whole life in the church hearing about, like you said, Bruce R. McConkie or the apostles or that, but there are these incredible thought leaders that were in, or sort of adjacent, who really shaped things and shaped a lot of us who are now older and trying to make a difference, trying to shape our own things now. So, and it all directly goes back to that, I think, the people that you come in contact with. So, Landon, do you have any final thoughts from Geoff, or we'll say goodbye for the day? I don't want to go. I don't want to. It was so good.
I love, Geoff, your teaching and the example you just gave. As you were speaking, I was sitting there thinking, as you said, your job was to empower your students and not to make them like you. And the church, you didn't make them wear blue shirts and tell them that they shouldn't get married like you, and that they, and just sit and tell them everything that you had done in your life. And we see that in the church. You got to dress like this. You got to speak like this. You've got to act like this. You've got to fit this mold. And how beautiful it is to see someone who says, I want to empower you to be the best you can be, not the best me that you can be.
Yeah, well, my students, they may have blue hair, but they don't wear blue shirts.
Blue hair is awesome.
Blue hair is awesome. I'm the first to say. I will just end by saying 3 short things. One, first of all, let me apologize. I realized looking at myself, I look like the jet lag person that I am. I look like
do not.
Anyway, I just got here yesterday and I'm extremely tired. Number 2, my whole life has been about intellectual pursuits, and I'm a very intellectual person by nature and whatever. But I will say, late in my life, on the one hand, I think you have to intellectually explore yourself and be honest about it. I agree that the unexamined life is not really worth living. You have to think about and confront things. But I also agree that in the end, intellectual structures are for the mind, but only unity will satisfy the heart. And that's where I think the answer really isn't, you're not going to persuade people to anything. You have to do it through connecting with them. And that's, so in that sense, I still am very much the Mormon I was when I was 5 years old, where my answer is to try and find a way to connect with people and unite with them, because there's no end to the intellectual dissonance you can find. There's no end to it. So be kind, be respectful. And when there's injustice, stand up and say, I will not stand for it, which is where I stand with the church right now. So
that's it. And I think a lot of people have arrived at that anymore. We will not stand for it. So, well, beautiful words from a beautiful person. I know that our viewers and listeners absolutely are going to love this podcast. I can't wait to get this out to everybody. And so we'll just say thank you again to Geoff, and thanks to my co-host Landon. Make sure that you like and subscribe to Mormonish. And if you'd like to be notified when our new episodes come out, you can hit that little notification bell and it'll let you know right away. And we actually did recently figure out how to accept donations. We had some people ask, they have indicated that they might like to support our efforts here on Mormonish. And if you'd like to, we have links to PayPal or Venmo in our show notes. So we just appreciate all of our listeners and viewers so much. And we love to hear from you, what you think. Please comment. Please, let us know. We'll get comments to Geoff if you want to, interact with him. He had so many wonderful things to say that I know resonated in so many different ways with all of us, wherever we're at. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Landon. And we'll say goodbye for now from Mormonish. Thank you.
Thank you, Landon. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.